The Liquor Amendment Bill, which has been on hold since 2018 and is now undergoing further review after South Africa's Department of Trade, Industry and Competition decided to take into consideration the impact of alcohol restrictions during COVID-19. Now, after the considerations, the department will reintroduce the bill to Parliament. The bill seeks to amend the National Liquor Act of 2003 by tightening alcohol restrictions, advertising and regulating where alcohol is also sold. During the COVID-19 pandemic, various alcohol restrictions were introduced, including reducing the number of days that alcohol is sold, as well as limiting the number of hours available for sale. A study by the University of Cape Town and the Medical Research Council found that alcohol bans during COVID were strongly associated with a large drop in unnatural deaths, that's murders, vehicle collisions, suicides, and even accidents. The amendments also propose banning alcohol advertising on radio and television at certain times and on billboards that are less than 100 meters away from junctions, street corners, and traffic circles. The 2018 World Health Organization Global Status Report on Alcohol Consumption placed South Africa as the 19th highest alcohol-consuming country in the world. South African drinkers over the age of 15 years consumed on average 64.4 grams of pure alcohol per day. And the data further show that South African drinkers over 15 also consume 29.9 liters of pure alcohol in a year. That's the third highest consumption in Africa. Joining me now for this conversation is Aadielah Diedericks. She's with the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance and SA General and their General Secretary. Welcome to the show, Aadielah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning, and thank you for having us.
So when we look at this policy, and this is a very long-standing conversation that South Africa has been having, when we look at the amendments that the bill is possibly going to undergo, we see that there's a lot of angles, and many people will be affected in different ways. But let's talk about why this seems to have taken so long to, again, get to this stage.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the background that you provided around the consumption issue in South Africa, because that is specifically why we need to move this bill. In South Africa, we went through an extensive consultation process during 2015-16, and that led to the amendment bill of 2017. It is unclear why this bill has taken so long to be moved. From our perspective, there are political reasons, which is probably not what we want to go into today. But we welcome the fact that the DTI has finally decided that this is a bill that needs to be moved. We welcome the fact that they have announced that the provincial laws might have to be aligned. And this is very important because currently the national law and the provincial laws do not act in sync with each other. Liquor licensing is a provincial authority, and some of them are acting under outdated laws as far as 1989. So a very welcome from our side, but we are concerned that the DTI is talking about reviewing the absence of consulting with the public and with public health advocates and researchers. The fact that they are talking about taking lessons from COVID is extremely important, because COVID certainly proved that if we only restricted the trading hours, we would have a significant benefit from reducing death and injuries in South Africa. I'm sure it was reported across the world that for the first time in the history of Baragwanath Hospital, they had New Year's Eve with absolutely no trauma admissions. And that was directly related to the fact that there was that alcohol was restricted, or alcohol availability was restricted. This is not about calling for the banning of alcohol, but rather looking at what does the evidence say around the potential positive impacts on society and not just the economy if we should restrict alcohol hours of sale.
All right. So, and of course, the larger conversation is one in which we're placing the conversation around the consumption how young some of those who are in South Africa who are drinking also are as well. And as you made the very vital point about the unintended and sometimes intended consequences of alcohol consumption as it may be. But I want to go back to something you said, and that was about sort of the synergy between the national and the provincial governments in regards to implementing this bill. Many have pointed out that there would be a need for extensive national provincial cooperation. And in terms of regulation, you have issues around retail sales and liquor licenses. Those things lie particularly with the provinces. Even in terms of liability issues, manufacturing, and even the drinking age would also need to be regulated by the national government. So you have sort of a multi-tiered sort of complex issue that will come about in terms of who is responsible for what. And this really needs to synergize it into one comprehensive sort of codified regulation for all of South Africa. In terms of it being a whole of government approach to this, how do you think it can be done?
Well, I think, and thank you once again for providing that context. I think that the recently adopted World Health Organization's Global Alcohol Action Plan specifically points out to the fact that we need a whole of government approach to dealing with the issues of alcohol-related harm. Currently, the tangible cost of alcohol-related harm to South African economy is in the region of 86 billion rand. And if we should include the intangible cost, that goes to around, for 2022, around 400 billion rand. So the challenge that government has is how do you weigh up the cost to the economy versus the cost that government is currently paying out to deal with alcohol-related harm. In South Africa, the alcohol industry has recently paid for another socioeconomic impact study, and this study has clearly reinforced that by adopting the liquor amendment bill, that includes increasing the age to 21, that includes regulating the economic zone, that includes limiting advertising and introducing the liability clause, would contribute to would result in reduced deaths in South Africa. Currently, we have around 172 deaths due to alcohol every day. We have it would reduce consumption amongst young people, specifically 15 to 19-year-olds, and that is where our crisis is. I'm sure you had coverage about the Enyobeni incident in the Eastern Cape, where children as young as 13 years died at liquor outlets. And this is what we seek to address by urging the government to adopt this liquor amendment bill. The Genesis Analytics study clearly outlined is that there would be very limited impact on the alcohol advertising industry, for instance, by introducing restrictions on advertising. It also clearly outlines that we would have less than 1,500 loss of jobs across the value chain if this bill should be aligned. So when the industry talks about the economic impact of this bill, the evidence and the research shows that there would be very limited impact on the cost to the different industries that is associated with the alcohol industry. What it would do, it would help South Africa begin to deal with the issue of young people and their consumption of alcohol, and it would reduce the injuries and death that we currently experience.
And you've taken me to what was naturally going to be my next question, but just for more context, let's let the audience know. This is an industry in South Africa that employs somewhere upwards of about 400,000. The number is around 415,000 people who are employed inside the alcohol industry in South Africa. And during COVID-19, particularly with the alcohol bans, we saw this industry really come out and tell the government about the potential of the job losses, but also estimating that around 30-something billion rand was actually lost in revenue. So in terms of the industry as it is now, what is their pushback? So you've mentioned that it's with the study, just about 1,000 plus jobs would be lost with this. And this really wouldn't bite into the revenue of the industry, which is put to be around some 71 billion in terms of the GVA, the gross value added to the South African gross domestic product. And that's not anything to laugh at. That's about 1 rand for every 79 rand of the country's GDP, which is attributable to the beer-related economic activity. So when you listen to the numbers, people would really want to say, okay, hold on, is there a compromise? Is there a way we can get what those who are worried about the alcohol consumption want, but also preserve jobs and continue to, I guess maybe we'd say, nurture an industry that continues to, in one way or the other, add something back to the GDP? So do you think there is that compromise available?
Well, we definitely agree that there's a space for the industry. What the South African government has the challenge of is how do they weigh up the responsibility they have towards its citizens and the current cost to the South African economy of alcohol-related harm is between 10 and 12% of GDP. So technically, the government is spending a lot more money on dealing with alcohol-related harm than it is actually generating from the alcohol industry. Beer in South Africa has been rated amongst the top 5 countries globally for the cheapest beer available in the world. And so there's clearly different things that the government has to look at. From our perspective, the key issue is how do we ensure that the industry can continue to exist whilst at the same time we begin to protect and promote the health and social well-being of South Africans. One of the ways that we have suggested is that the industry can contribute towards a fund where we take 1% of the output of the tax revenue and have that placed in an independent fund that would allow government and civil society to draw resources to deal with alcohol-related harm. This is something that has been implemented in countries like Thailand, where they have a 2% levy that is directly diverted to an independent fund that tackles the issue of alcohol and tobacco. And we believe that this is something that could be done in South Africa as it could be done across the region as well. I see you have highlighted the different things that the bill seeks to address. And the Genesis study has said that if we increase the age, legal drinking age to 21, we would reduce the consumption between 15 and 19-year-olds with about 3.4%. Now, that is not something to scoff at. It also says that if we introduce this, we would reduce the deaths on our roads, particularly amongst young people. Part of the challenge that we face across the globe is that the age at which young people come,
introduced,
or the age at which we come of age in our society is generally around the age of 18. It's the time that we vote. But it is also the time of experimentation. It's the time of influence of the peers. And advertising in particular is an issue. It drives young people's consumption. Evidence shows that young people's exposure to alcohol advertising increases the amount of alcohol that young people drink in any one session, which leads to binge drinking. It also influences the age at which young people begins to experiment. So by taking on that issue, South Africa seeks to gain better, saving lives of children, because 15-year-olds are children. And it would reduce the way in which young people consume alcohol. The Enyobeni incident, I think, has completely highlighted the need for addressing this. When we saw 13, 14, 15, 18-year-olds lose their lives because they assumed, they've bought into the narrative that celebration is equated with alcohol. And this is what the issue around banning advertising to the point of sale means. If you just look at the ad that you have currently, it's a beautiful ad. It invites you into the life of drinking. We're not saying that people shouldn't drink, but we should get people to begin to drink differently. And we should get young people to focus on what is their dreams about the future, how do they want to get there, rather than collecting their pennies to try and have a celebration with alcohol.
All right, so let's talk about next steps as we wrap up now. There has been some bits of back and forth. As you mentioned earlier, it doesn't seem like the Trade Department has been very good in terms of talking to the stakeholders, the DTI. So who is in conversation on this? What are the next steps? Because it is, of course, being up for reconsideration now. Do you believe there are going to be any changes? Is there any influence that the alcohol industry in South Africa is able to exert right now? And where do we expect it to be in front of Parliament? What time? What's the timeline looking like?
Well, that's the key thing, is that the alcohol industry has had influence in stalling this bill. This is the Genesis study that I referred to, is the second one that they have paid for in the past 5 years. And they're clearly using it as a way to stall moving forward this bill. What is important is that the DTI has recognized that the issue of the trading hours of retail and not necessarily manufacturing and distribution is an important area, because that is what COVID showed, is limiting the hours of trade, of sale at the point of retail. That is important. So from our perspective, we certainly look forward to working with the government on this. And we would urge them that within the next year, that we move forward to taking into consideration some of the lessons learned from COVID, and that we get this bill passed, hopefully before the new administration comes into power.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we'll leave the conversation at that. It is one that's a very interesting one, particularly when you look at, as you said, sort of this association that many of us across the continent have with alcohol in its traditional and also modern forms, a form of celebration, a form of commemoration in many ways. But Africa does need to have a conversation about how young Africans are getting caught up in what could be a very dangerous lifestyle for them. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, and thank you for having us.
All right. It's a bill that has, of course, a bit of controversy. The industry claiming that there would be some loss of life, I beg your pardon, loss of livelihood there is. And then, of course, also around issues around the revenue and how much it contributes to the GDP of South Africa. But with the conversation we've had, my guest has clearly said that it is much more important for us to focus on the lives of South Africans that are being lost to alcohol-related incidents. And of course, all of that can be handled if the industry comes together with the fund and the industry takes responsibility. We'll see how that plays out. There is some time left to decide how far and in what ramification this bill goes before South Africa's parliament.